In 1898, a Canadian sea captain named Joshua Slocum sailed into Newport Harbor, completing a 46,000-mile voyage, the first man ever to sail alone around the world. His voyage has inspired thousands to follow in his wake. His book on the voyage is a classic of maritime literature. His complex life swung from poverty to presidents, through mutiny, shipwreck, prison, and even murder. He is Joshua Slocum, a New World Columbus.
There's a man in England who makes copies of the spray, and he estimates that as many as 800 have been made since Slocum's own voyage, which was from 1895 to 1898. So he's had a huge influence on people because what he did really changed people's ideas of freedom and of independence.
He is honored with plaques from Briar Island to Tasmania.
Slocum is more than the inspiration. He's the man who did it. And he's the man by which you compare what you do.
Who is this man who inspires such enthusiasm? Slocum was born on the edge of the Bay of Fundy in, he writes, a cold spot on coldest North Mountain on a cold February 20th, 1844. Briar Island at the entrance of the Bay of Fundy. Then they would have sailed for the little island. Today, you arrive by a ferry named for the island's most celebrated son. Fascinated by the ships outside the grimy windows, he would retreat into his own world, carving a complex ship model. When his father found what he called the devil's handiwork, he smashed it underfoot, destroying what was left of his relationship with his son. When his mother died a year later, Slocum ran away to sea, first as a cook on a schooner, and then on a deal droger sailing for Liverpool. The company on today's tall ships may be better than it was in Slocum's day, but the sea is unchanged. On his epic but ridiculously underfinanced voyage, alone around the world.
My old chronometer, which was a good one, had been long in disuse. I tried to get it cleaned and rated, but they wanted $15 for it. $15. They may as well ask for the moon.
So Slocum navigated some of the world's most difficult and treacherous waters using a $1 tin clock. Slocum's interests were narrow but deep. He was obsessed with the sea, in love with it. The ship had a close brush with Krakatoa, the most terrible volcanic explosion in all of history. Off South Africa, it was hit by a storm that destroyed its sails and all its cargo. But Slocum soldiered on, downgrading to a smaller ship, the Aquidneck. David Sinnott Jones's voyage is almost as remarkable. This 71-year-old with one lung sailed his Liberdade alone from Wales to Brazil, and then recreated Slocum's route, sailing from Paranagua to Martha's Vineyard. The world was changing rapidly. In a Boston shipyard, a chance meeting with an old whaler would put his life back on course. Captain Eben Peirce was a whaling captain who had made his fortune and contributed mightily to the decimation of the world's whales by inventing the power harpoon. He listened to the tale of Captain Slocum's declining fortunes. The ship Peirce was offering was the Spray. This is where he rebuilt it, where he launched it. Ignoring the Yankee naysayers who asked how it would pay to rebuild the old derelict, Slocum set to work. Having spent 13 months at exactly $553.62 on the boat, after lingering in Gloucester, he sailed for his old hometown of Westport, Briar Island, Nova Scotia. What did he find on the island he had left 35 years earlier? A place little changed, and indeed not profoundly changed today, though now full of memorials to its most famed resident. His next landfall was the Azores, just as the transoceanic wanderers sailing in Slocum's wake do today. Or so said the newspapers, and so says his book. Were they really pirates? Or were they just dark-skinned sailors traveling the same course he was on, turned into pirates by his imagination.
He was not a foolhardy sailor. He was quite conservative. He knew what to do. He knew when to do it. I mean, his remarkable voyage sailing through the Straits of Magellan with all of its adverse winds and storms, well, that in itself is a feat that would make the man famous. He was blown out of the Straits, blown back into the Straits, sailed out again.
Today you could say it's the calm before the storm. It's one of these dead calm days, hardly any wind, we're hardly making any headway. But within an hour we could start having a snowstorm.
On Valentine's Day, 1896, Slocum arrived at the dusty Chilean port of Punta Arenas. There, in a sail loft, he met an old sea captain who suggested a defense technique against the Patagonian natives.
Captain Pedro Samblich gave Joshua a box of tacks, and he told him to sprinkle these on the deck at night so that should any natives try and board him and kill him or take his boat, they would be first stepping on the tacks. And sure enough, these tacks probably saved Joshua's life and allowed him to carry on his single-handed round-the-world voyage.
In Australia, he hauled the boat out for repairs and began to give lectures with magic lantern slides. Mariners like David Sinnott Jones are still continuing the tradition. Here, in the same village hall where Slocum himself had spoken 100 years earlier. Sailing with Sam McKenney off Vancouver, aboard his Northern Spray, talking to him at the bow with no one at the helm, confirms that the Spray design is mysteriously able to sail itself.
Slocum wrote a classic, and that classic has withstood the years, a century now, because he says so much about what sailing is all about.
Now again, Slocum cut a new swath, being one of the very first non-commercial boats to use the canal in the way it's used today, a passage for adventurers between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic and then the South Seas. He took off into a November gale and was never seen again. He may have foundered in that gale. He may have fallen overboard. Perhaps the old girl sprung a plank. But most likely, one of his hated steamships had finally caught up with him.